call the special joint City Council and Planning Commission meeting to order. And Ms. Stewart, I ask you to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Ms. Gamero, would you please take the roll?
Councilmember Koberstein?
Here.
Councilmember Knudsen?
Present.
Councilmember Shuteau?
Here.
Vice Mayor Doring?
Here.
Mayor Ellsworth?
Here.
Commissioner Monette?
Here.
Commissioner Anderson?
Here.
Commissioner Hale?
Here.
Vice Chair Pont?
Here.
Chair Hardy?
Here. That brings us to item 4 on the agenda, which is misleadingly titled Public Forum, at which point I'm supposed to explain that because this is a special meeting, there is no public forum. So public comment is limited to what's on the agenda. Each person's comments shall be limited to 4 minutes. I'm not sure if that means we're supposed to take the comments now or later.
So
This is a new one for this chair.
sure. So typically for these items, since there is not public comment on items not on the agenda, you just notify people that there isn't public comment, and then you have the item and then entertain public comment as you normally would for an item.
That's what I thought. Thank you. Just wanted to be sure. So then that brings us to the business before us for this special joint meeting, which is item 5.1, a presentation regarding the 2019 housing legislation. And I believe that Mr. Walsh will make that presentation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. And good evening, council members and commission members. My name is Ethan Walsh. I am the Assistant City Attorney. Carrie Ueda, the City Attorney, asked that I give this presentation. I'm part of our firm's housing working group and do a lot of land use and zoning law. And so I've been pretty immersed in some of this new legislation, and so wanted to give you an update on some of the new bills that have come forward in the last legislative session. And now is an especially good time to do this, one, because you're going to have to start dealing with these as housing projects come before you, but also because your staff has embarked on the process of updating your zoning code to bring it in compliance with your newly adopted general plan. And so with these bills in mind, it's there's some changes that will need to be made to address these. So in your materials, I provide you a summary of some of the bills that I'm going to go over. They're in quite a bit of detail, the summaries. So I have a presentation. I'll go through each of the bills individually, spending a bit more time on the first 2 and then briefly going over the others. I would encourage questions. I'm thinking probably the best way to do this is I'll go through a bill and then ask if there's any questions, and then go to the next one and ask if there's questions, and then if there's any collective discussion that you want to have at the end, I'll do that. We can do that. And
Sounds good.
Could I ask a question of the chair?
Certainly.
Mr. Hardy, is this a time-limited presentation? Because I understand that your meeting starts at 7:10. So do we have essentially an hour and a certain number of minutes to go through this presentation, have public comment, and is that correct? Or
That is exactly right.
okay. So efficiency is important.
Yes, or brevity is the soul of wit or something.
Right.
Thank you.
And I will do my best to be as brief as I can. You have the materials that I provided, and so if that initiate any thoughts that you have questions, I want to make this tailored to what your interests are and what your concerns are. So I would encourage questions. So I'll go over the bills briefly, and then you can ask any questions that you have.
Thanks. I'll just observe for everyone's benefit at the outset that I think there's so much content here that we will not have enough time to fully explore through questions and answers everything that might be of interest or concern. I expect to some extent this will be an ongoing discussion, but I'll do my best as chair to keep us moving and to allow some time for public comment as well. Thank you.
So with that, essentially the things that I'm planning on covering in the presentation are the new laws that are related to the local review of housing developments. Basically, the gist of most of these bills, a theme behind all of this, is that the state is making an effort to streamline a lot of housing approvals. There's concern at the state level that housing is obviously more and more expensive, and they believe that part of the reason for those increases in expenses is due to the time and expense involved with the local review process for housing development, and that in some communities it's inordinately difficult to get housing approved. So a lot of these bills focus on placing limits on local review of housing developments, streamlining the process to the extent they can. There's new legislation related to accessory dwelling units, which the state views as one of the key mechanisms to increase density in existing single-family neighborhoods, where you put additional units on existing developed lots, and ensuring that communities actually adopt their housing elements, adopt legally compliant housing elements, and try to put some more teeth behind the enforcement of ensuring that those housing elements get adopted. And then there's some minor changes to the density bonus laws to encourage affordable housing and to essentially enhance the availability of density bonuses to 100% affordable projects. So the key one, and the one that I'll probably spend the most time on because it's the one that is creating the most kind of discussion at the statewide level, is SB 330, which is known as the 2019 Housing Crisis Act. This bill places new limits on cities and counties' ability to regulate housing developments. Housing developments are defined under the Housing Accountability Act as residential projects, mixed-use projects where 2/3 or more of the square footage in the development is set aside for residential and transitional and supportive housing. This bill, it makes changes to the Permit Streamlining Act, the Housing Accountability Act, and adopts a new section referred to as the Housing Crisis Act that I'll talk about in a couple slides. So one of the first steps that this bill takes is that it creates a new preliminary application process whereby when a developer comes in for a development application for a housing project, they submit a preliminary application with a checklist that's dictated by state law. Once that preliminary application is submitted, that essentially freezes in place the requirements that exist as applied to that project as it moves through the development project. So it essentially vests its rights to be reviewed under the rules that are in place at that time. Now that's a change from what's typically allowed under law. Typically, local jurisdictions can make changes to their local requirements as time goes on, and you don't vest until you actually have your entitlements and are moving forward with the project. But this locks those in place to limit kind of the unexpected expenses or changes that could occur for a developer as they move through the process. The contents of the preliminary application, each jurisdiction has to come up with their own checklist, but that's essentially dictated by state law now. The State Department of Housing and Community Development is charged with creating kind of a default checklist for those communities that don't go through the process of adopting their own checklist. But in any event, whether it's the local checklist or the one dictated by state law, it can only cover specific enumerated issues, including a description of the project, the basic characteristics of the site, specific environmental concerns, the potential that the applicant is going to be seeking a density bonus for the project. There's specific issues that have to be addressed if it's located in the coastal zone. You have to indicate if any units are going to be demolished, and the location of specific recorded easements on the property. So it makes things much less discretionary at the local level. It really tries to make things as uniform and as consistent for developers as they can moving forward. There's new streamlining provisions. They're included as part of the law. One of the key ones, which I think can be a struggle in some communities, is that there is a limit to no more than 5 hearings that can be held on a project, provided that it's consistent with the existing general plan and zoning standards at the time that the pre-application is submitted. And when we talk about 5 hearings, that includes hearings is defined extremely broadly. So any hearing before a commission is considered a hearing. So if you have any other advisory commissions or advisory bodies that provide advice to the council and or planning commission on housing developments, that's one hearing. When you have an application that comes before the planning commission, that's one hearing. If you continue an item, so if you have a hearing on one night and then there are additional issues that you want to address, or it gets late into the evening dealing with it and you continue it to the next meeting, each of those meetings is one hearing. So the number of hearings can add up pretty quickly, and there's a limit to 5 hearings that you're allowed to have by state law for any housing project. For rezoning, there's limitations on rezoning. Essentially, if housing is allowed under the general plan requirements for the project, that project is entitled to go forward. Rezoning is typically a legislative act and discretionary, but if it's compliant with the general plan requirements for the area where the project is located, then you can't require a rezoning of that property. And this is one of the key issues that is kind of a theme throughout a lot of the new legislation, is that you can only impose objective zoning standards to the project. So one of the issues that comes up throughout this bill and in the Housing Accountability Act that dictates the review of housing projects generally is the new trend towards saying that we're only allowed to impose objective standards on projects as they move forward, and we're only entitled to deny projects if they're inconsistent with our objective standards. So a lot of the standards that are typically used in design review and sometimes in zoning codes are more subjective. They can be requirements like requiring that a development be in scale with an adjoining neighborhood, or that that the character of a project be consistent with the surrounding neighborhood. Those types of requirements are not objective, and so those can no longer serve as a basis for denying a new housing project. Lastly, there's been changes to the Permit Streamlining Act to decrease the amount of time that you have to approve a project after certification of an EIR from 120 days down to 90 days, and it's 60 days for low-income projects that are seeking public funding. The Permit Streamlining Act, while it's a short time, but it generally doesn't come up with housing projects because most communities consider the EIR or the environmental considerations at the same time that they decide whether or not they approve the project. But every once in a while, an issue comes up where you will certify an EIR and say that we've done the appropriate environmental review for a project, but we have not yet, but you don't approve the project, that starts a fairly short time frame ticking for you to review that project and approve or deny it. So it only gives you 90 days to do so. Lastly, the bill, SB 330, adopts what they refer to as the Housing Crisis Act, that applies on a temporary basis to urbanized areas, and St. Helena, the the Department of Housing and Community Development has already designated what communities are urbanized areas, and St. Helena is an urbanized area under the definition. And it restricts changes that you can make to your existing rules as they apply to housing. So while this bill is in effect, you are not permitted to rezone property that is where housing is currently allowed, to decrease the density or decrease the ability to develop housing on that site. You cannot make changes to the general plan designation to decrease the ability to develop housing. The only exception to this is if you are able to decrease housing in one area if you increase it somewhere else. So if you do a rezone to a residential property that, say, has 20 units, you have a piece of property that you want to rezone to commercial, that will eliminate the availability of 20 units, then you have to rezone another property where housing isn't currently allowed to make up for that 20 units. So it has to be a like-for-like exchange so that you have no net loss in the availability of housing. Additionally, if you have a project that is going to demolish residential units, then that project has to ensure that an equal number of units will be replaced. So, for example, you couldn't demolish a 50-unit multifamily project and then develop it with low density residential for, say, 12 units or whatever. You would have to make up the additional units that you're losing elsewhere. Lastly, while this bill is in effect, no moratoriums or similar restrictions on housing developments are permitted, and these include moratoriums that are adopted by a local initiative. The only exceptions are in place is if you can make findings that there's an imminent threat to public health and safety, and that must be approved to HCD. The same goes for growth control measures that would limit housing going forward. And as I stated before, the cities are prohibited from imposing new subjective design standards on projects under the Housing Crisis Act. So kind of the take-home messages of that bill are the preliminary application checklist, which kind of sets a uniform approach to these projects moving forward, and the fact that once that application has been made under that checklist, that freezes the current development standards in place. We're only able to impose objective zoning standards on new projects, and as we're moving forward, obviously we're going through this process right now, but to the extent that there's potential inconsistencies between zoning and general plan densities, the general plan densities are the ones that would apply until we get our zoning code in compliance with those. So that's the one that I have to cover the most information on. I know it's a lot of information to cover in a short period of time. Are there any questions on SB 330 initially before I go on to the next bill?
I have one.
Yes, Mary?
Well, just on what you've just said on the, let's see, these pages aren't numbered. Let's see. Yeah, page 22, the approval timeframes. What if the developer causes a delay in the time frame? Do the limits still apply?
Which time frames?
Well, it says here shortened from 120 to 90 days following an EIR, 60 days for low-income people. The city has to act. I'm saying, but what if the developer, delays the process? Would that time frame still apply?
It would, but what I would say is that time frame specifically would be between the adoption of the adoption of, or the certification of the environmental document and approval of the project. So usually by that time you have enough information that you can make a decision one way or the other. If there's delays earlier in the process, that time frame hasn't triggered yet. So there's not as much of a risk, but you would have to make a decision within that time frame.
Even if it's the developer who calls for a timeout, because that's happened here.
Sure. And so what I would say is, under the law, there is an ability to extend, I believe it's for 60 days. There's a one-time kind of opportunity to mutually agree to extend that time frame, but that's it. That's all there is. And then after that, you do need to make a decision one way or the other. And so that just requires you to act. And again, I should say, I want to emphasize that under the Permit Streamlining Act, that short-term time frame, it's usually not triggered. Like usually when the developer asks for a timeout, it's earlier in the process before that clock starts ticking.
And then I'm just curious, since there is cities are prohibited from imposing subjective design standards, are these essentially ministerial, as a ministerial process then? It won't be coming to the Planning Commission? Because what would the Planning Commission have to look at if only the objective, considerations are important?
That's an excellent question. And it would not be ministerial, but you would be governed by the objective standards that are in place. So you're right. A lot of what planning commissions historically have done is they use their expertise and their familiarity with the community to apply community standards to given projects. And as they continue to make these projects more and more objective in the standards, kind of these, check the box kind of standards, it does take a lot of that discretion away. I should emphasize that this only applies to housing projects. So other projects that come forward, you still have that level of discretion.
Right. Okay, so the answer is no, yes.
So it's technically not ministerial, but what your charge would be to take the objective standards that are in place and apply those to the project and see whether or not it meets those objective standards or not. Okay. So and again, kind of the state's goal behind this is to streamline housing as much as they can and accelerate these projects. And in a lot of communities, housing projects have been denied because they're inconsistent with community character and the like, and the state is making a value judgment where they think it is more important to get these housing projects approved than it is to be consistent with kind of those general kind of character issues that communities think are oftentimes very important in considering whether or not a project would be appropriate.
Right. And I was also wondering,
Commissioner Manette, I'm going to cut you off so that we can keep this going. Excuse me, but I'm
will there be a
concerned about the time.
Right, I hear.
We'll be talking about these things.
Okay, and we
over
can
and
get
over.
some expert answers.
Yeah.
At some later time. Okay.
We'll need to. I don't think there's any way we can get completely educated tonight.
Okay.
Councilmember Coverstein, I believe you had a question.
I just had one quick question. You mentioned downzoning residential property, and you could do it if you offset it with increased density, and I thought I heard you say on non-residentially zoned property. So does that mean you couldn't downzone one residential property and offset it by upzoning another?
I think you could, and I was trying to use that as a kind of a concrete example, but I think you could upzone one property if you downzoned another. So
Okay.
Decrease the density on one, increase another. The law on that is the way that they've kind of phrased that implementation is very unclear, in my opinion. But that's the way I think it would work.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Commissioner Pond.
I have one. I have dozens, but let's start with one. Most, actually, the large majority of projects that the commission sees is either a house remodel that's going through design review or a scrape and replace that's going through demolition and then design review. Being that there's a residence on there already, do these apply?
Right. That is a good question, and I do need to give that a little thought, and I've had some brief conversations with your staff about that. But so the law does not do away with your more subjective requirements, like and so those still exist, and the goal of the law is to encourage the development of new housing. So when you're in a situation where you're not developing new housing, but you're essentially reconfiguring somehow existing housing from one existing unit to an existing unit that looks different, I tend to think that these rules would not apply in the same way. But I should say that we need to spend some time on that, and as projects come forward, I think staff will be advising you on that.
And court time and appeals and a Supreme Court ruling at the end of the day. Yeah.
Sure. Right. Yeah. It is. It's one of these. It is that kind of bill that is going to raise those kinds of questions. So.
Any other questions? I'm going to edit my list then. I think Commissioner Ponce covered one or two of them, but I'm wondering, with respect to the preliminary application checklist, as I understand it, HCD is charged with creating a kind of default template. We have some latitude to vary from that. How do we if we wish to have our own, what is it we get to do that's different from the template? Or to put it even differently, is there enough discretion left to even bother from varying from the template?
Right. And I don't really know how to answer that at this point, in part because I don't know what their template is going to look like. And I think there's some ability to structure it so there's things on the template, things like, requirements for the coastal zone and the like, that obviously don't apply. So there's components of it that, to streamline the process, you could tailor it so it better fits your community. But it's difficult at this point to really say whether or not it's worth your while to do so. So, I mean, there's some kind of wait and see components to it.
Understood. I'll just observe here, sort of more broadly, that one of the big concerns I have, with respect to the Planning Commission's work is the uncertainty we're faced in this implementation period for these new laws. We've already had one question come up tonight about the applicability of 330 to, individual residential projects, and we have at least one of those, I think, on tonight's agenda. I mean, the concrete content that invokes some of these questions is in front of us from here forward. So I don't know that there's anything we can do about the pace at which clarity comes, but I am hoping for updates, memos, something as soon as they are available, because otherwise I don't see what the Planning Commission can do other than what it's been doing.
Right. Right. And I would just say, at this point, for example, with the project that's before you tonight, my advice is to do what you've been doing. And as we learn more and we see how things progress, and as there's more clarity, then yes, we'll do our best to provide it to you. And we're in conversation with city staff about how to apply these new laws to projects as they move forward.
Thank you.
So we can consider the subjective aspects of the
we shouldn't get into a lot of conversation about that project until it's before you, but I would just say until we tell you something differently, you should do things as you normally have.
Thank you. Well, I think we're ready to go on to the next one.
Okay. So the next is a series of bills related to accessory dwelling units. And as I discussed at the outset, accessory dwelling units are individual units that are located on a property with an existing home already on them. Sometimes they're referred to as back houses in a lot of communities, and they serve to provide additional density in existing residential neighborhoods. A lot of the developed communities, traditionally, obviously in California, there was a lot of kind of single-family residential developments in areas that are now extremely dense and urbanized, and so this gives an opportunity to provide additional housing in those areas. And so the state is taking significant steps to facilitate the development of accessory dwelling units, and there's some significant shifts that have been made in these bills. So there's several bills that have been enacted. The ones listed there at the top in the first two, there was essentially multiple bills that had been moved forward that were essentially extremely similar, and the last one that was enacted moved forward. So that's AB 881. That's the most significant one. Then AB 671, AB 670, and AB 587. So AB 881 is what I'll spend the most time on. And so some of the changes are that under AB 8, traditionally, accessory dwelling units have been allowed on properties that are zoned for single-family residential. They're now allowed for both single-family and multifamily residential. So if you have a multifamily development on a parcel, that parcel is also eligible to receive ADUs. There is changes to the law to allow multiple ADUs on one lot. For a single-family property, they are allowed to develop both an ADU and what's called a junior ADU, which is a small ADU that would be inside the existing structure of the house. So if there was changes made to the configuration of the interior of the house to allow for an additional unit on site, a junior ADU and an ADU would be allowed by right on single-family residences, and for multifamily residences, I believe it's two ADUs would be permitted by right on the lot. There is a maximum of 4-foot setbacks that are allowed on the property. If you construct an ADU in an existing garage or carport, you cannot impose a requirement that they replace the parking that they would the covered parking that they would lose as a result of that conversion. And there is, under the previous ADU law, communities had the ability to require that the owner of the property live in either the main house or the ADU. That's no longer, you're no longer allowed to impose that requirement. So both units could be rental units under the existing law as it's changed.
Mr. Hardy? May I ask a question on that?
Well, I thought we would wait until he's finished the ADU section. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to try and go through this quickly because I know we're short on time. There is the law has changed under the previous law. If you did a conversion say, an existing structure, then you were entitled to do that and getting only a building permit. Now there are specific units, ADUs, that you can build with only a building permit for both conversions of existing structures and the construction of new structures, provided they're consistent with the limited requirements that they impose on essentially the size and the setbacks. If there is a non-conforming structure and it is converted to an ADU, so say a garage that's too close to the setback and it's non-conforming, typically if you did construction on that, they would have to bring it into conformance with your existing zoning. If they're converting it to an ADU, they no longer have to do that. Additionally, if there are any inconsistencies between your existing ordinance and the new state legislation, that can void your entire ordinance. So you essentially have to apply state law as things go forward. Some of the other bills that are not as comprehensive as 881 are AB 671. That is a revision to the housing element law to state that as part of your next housing element, you would have to include a section that details how you are promoting the development of ADUs to provide a means of housing with affordable rent. AB 587 is a bill of pretty limited application, which in rare circumstances a nonprofit could establish a structure where they could actually sell the ADU separately, but it's kind of a complicated situation where the property would be owned by the owner of the ADU and the main house as tenants in common, and it would be restricted to a covenant. So it is a change to the law to provide another means to provide affordable housing, but it's a pretty limited application. And then lastly, AB 670, this is more significant for a lot of communities. It prohibits the enactment or enforcement of CC&Rs that prevent the development of ADUs in communities. There are a lot of planned communities that do have CC&Rs that prohibit the development of ADUs. And so while cities have to comply with their zoning and state law and say that that there is, the ADUs are allowed in a lot of planned communities, the homeowners association have taken the position that they can prohibit that. The law now explicitly states that they must conform with state law, and if someone applies for the development of an ADU, they cannot prohibit it per their CC&Rs. So that is everything on ADUs. So with that, I would take questions on those bills.
Thank you. Councilmember Knudsen.
Thank you, Chairperson Hardy. We have a requirement that's currently on our books that we're not allowed to have ADUs in front yards. I see now we have a 4-foot setback. Does that mean that ADUs can go in front of the main house?
That is a good question, and that's a topic of a fair bit of conversation at the kind of across the state. And there are people who are taking the position that yes, that you do have to allow ADUs in front yards. I don't read the legislation that way. What it says is it talks about you're limited to a 4-foot setback, side and rear setback. And so I read that as saying that you can continue to maintain your front yard setbacks. So again, this could be another situation where there's going to be some litigation on that going forward, but the way that I read the bill right now is that it does not require you to approve ADUs in a front yard.
Thank you.
Chair, just a brief question.
Please.
On the HOA limitations and restrictions, what would happen if there was an indirect kind of impediment to building? For example, there may be an HOA that has a height restriction on their home, their initial home, single family, or even the outbuildings, and that could an argument be made that height limitation indirectly may prohibit the building of of an ADU. Would that also be a unlawful under the current law?
So under the ADU law as it's revised, you're allowed to have restrictions on things like height and setback and the like, provided that that the limitations that you have ensure that you can provide an ADU of specific dimensions. I think the height limit is 16 feet that's required under state law. So if you had something that was lower than that, then I think the HOA would have to approve it.
Any other questions on ADUs?
I just have one. I mean, this isn't so far-fetched because we have at least one neighborhood here in town that I happen to live in that prohibits more than one residential unit on a lot. And we had a case dealing with that. So my take is the city just goes ahead and ministerially approves, and the homeowners association would not be able to enforce that. Is that right?
Yes, that's my read. And this has come up for me before, and my position usually is that issue's between the homeowners association and their residents regardless. And so we approve per our regulations and state law, and then whatever they do, whatever's in their CC&Rs is really their issue.
Thank you.
Even if it is in conflict with the state law?
Well, then I would say that if the homeowner wanted to build it and their HOA was saying they couldn't, then they could go ahead and build it. And if their HOA tried to stop them, their HOA would lose that lawsuit.
Okay.
So.
Mayor Ellsworth?
I had a question about the on AB 671, talking about housing elements must promote ADUs for affordable rent. I'm just wondering how that gets included into the housing element. Does it talk about mechanisms that a city can bring in to encourage that or incentivize that? Is it broad, or are there some specifics within that?
There are not specifics. I mean, it's a short change to the law. I think it's a paragraph or two, and so I don't know how. I don't know exactly what people will do as kind of the next. That's coming up. The next cycle of housing elements is kind of in process right now. So I'm sure as people are thinking about how they do it, there's consultants who work on that and the like, and they're going to come up with, discussions of how that's being done. To me, it's a little bit odd because what you do with ADUs is it's largely dictated by state law. You have to approve them, and as long as they're within specific dimensions. And so I don't see the connection really, to be honest with you. But I think as they move forward, people will probably be having, the planning community and the like will have discussions about how they want to implement that.
Thank you.
I have a question. We approved last year, because of one of these laws, as a city, we could have approved one or two ADUs per parcel, but we approved one. Now, with this current law, can that be challenged, or since that's the city's decision, will that stand as the city's decision?
If it was approved last year, then it would stand.
Okay.
If I could.
Commissioner Pott?
One of the bills talks about connected ADUs and how those can be up to half the size of the main house they're connected to. How exactly, and there doesn't seem to be a definition of connected anywhere. What does that mean?
Well, I read it as mean that they share a wall, and so and I think I can envision situations where there would be something like a hallway that connects one to the other, and then there's a pathway between. But I think it essentially attached to the existing unit.
A breezeway, an open work connection between two roofs. I mean, what are we talking about? Any and all of the above? No definition.
Yeah, I don't think
Take a
it's.
guess.
I don't think it
Okay.
is. But I would say if it's if there is whatever material that actually where the two are adjoined to one another, that the better argument is that they are connected. And you're right. It's it's for if you have a very large house, it could be a very large ADU.
Yeah, and not subject to design review.
Correct.
I think we're ready for the next.
I just have one more question. Our current ordinance requires you to get a use permit if you're going to convert a single-family home to a duplex or a triplex. Is the duplex more or less out the window because is that use permit no longer valid because you are allowed to have this separate dwelling unit that's limited in size but part of the unit?
So I think of a duplex as different than a main house and an ADU.
Okay.
I know it would be 2 units on one property, but typically a duplex, the 2 units are the same size or close to the same size, whereas with an ADU, even under the scenario that Commissioner Ponte raised, one is smaller than the other, and so it is a different type of situation. But I have had situations recently where, in an effort to get multiple units on a single property, these are the mechanisms they use. They try to get ADUs on a lot so that they can get as many essentially beds. I've seen it in college communities where they want to get as many beds into one lot so that they can kind of rent to multiple students, and so they use the ADU to kind of maximize the use of that rather than doing something like at a duplex where it's a functional equivalent where they're getting the same kind of square footage of housing that they would in a duplex, but the structure's a little bit different. But I think there's distinguishing a duplex is still a duplex. I think it's different than a main house and an ADU.
This brings up one more question, if I could. So you've got a duplex. It's multiple units on the lot. So now you're allowed 2 ADUs and 2 junior ADUs? So you got 5 units in a duplex?
No, because I was talking about single family. So if it's a duplex, that's a different type of zoning. That would be, I would say a duplex would be multiple families. So you could get multiple ADUs on that property, but I would say that's a multi-family zoning.
Yeah, so you said earlier you're now allowed 2 ADUs on a multifamily lot.
Right.
So that would be 4.
Yeah.
And then 2 junior ADUs in each of the main houses?
No,
so
I
that's
don't.
6?
I would have to check on that, but I don't think it. I think it would be the two ADUs in addition to the duplex.
And no junior ADUs?
I would have to
Even
double
though
check
it
to make
seems
sure.
To me, the statute specifically speaks to junior ADUs.
On single
Multiples.
families.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have no more duplexes. We have 6plexes or 5plexes.
However it works, I am concerned about providing time for public comment. So
Sure. I can get through the rest. Why don't I get through the rest of the bills? Are not as substantive. Why don't I go through all of them, and then we can move on to public comment. Oh, so the next one is the Housing Omnibus Bill, which was actually adopted in the middle of 2019. And while it's a very long bill, it as applied to the issues that we're dealing with tonight, it's not all that substantive. The one significant, there's a number of grant programs that provide additional money for housing, which is great, but it's we don't need to get into detail on that. The most significant thing that was included in that bill is provisions to allow for more stringent enforcement of housing element compliance. You may have read about some of the publicity that Governor Newsom got when he was going after, I believe, some cities in Southern California for failure to adopt a legally compliant housing element and actually sued under that. What this bill does is it creates kind of more significant enforcement mechanisms in the event that a community is found to be out of compliance. So essentially, HCD, when they find that you're not in compliance, they can refer the issue to the Attorney General's office, and they're able to sue on that. And it includes new penalties. So if the city is not in compliance within 12 months after the court determines that they have a legally non-compliant housing element, the court will hold a status conference and has the ability to impose fines of between $10,000 and $100,000 per month. If they haven't brought their housing element into compliance 3 months after that, there's another status conference, and the fines can triple from that per month. If another 3 months pass and they still haven't complied with their with the housing element law, the fines will be multiplied by 6, and the court has the ability to appoint a receiver to take charge of enacting the city's housing element. So so that's kind of the takeaway of this bill, is that it gives the Attorney General a much larger stick to go after jurisdictions that are ignoring the requirements of the housing element law. Next are some changes to the density bonus law. If you're not familiar with the density bonus law, essentially it's a law that's been in place for a long time to encourage the development of affordable housing. And if you set aside a given number of units within a market rate development for affordable housing, you have certain incentives that are available to you, including increasing the density on your site, and you can apply, depending on the number of or the percentage of affordable housing that you provide, for certain concessions and waivers of existing development requirements. So what AB 1763 does is it ramps up the availability of concessions significantly for projects that are 100% affordable, and that can be up to 20% moderate units, but at least 80% of the units must be available to households of low income or below, and low income is roughly 80% of the area median income in your region. The density bonus is available for these projects would be that you can increase your density up to 80% more than the maximum allowable density under your zoning ordinance, and if it is within 1 mile of a major transit stop, then there is no density limit. So you can fit as many units in there as you are legally able to within the confines of your other zoning requirements, like height limitations, floor area ratio, setbacks, etc. In addition to that, each project has the availability of at least 4 regulatory concessions. There are no minimum parking requirements for affordable housing projects that apply for this, and if they're within a half mile of a major transit stop, then they have the ability to get a height increase of up to 3 stories or 33 feet. Lastly, I just wanted to note there were some changes to the Surplus Lands Act. The Surplus Lands Act is the law that's in place when you have land that you no longer need and you plan to sell it. There's a process that you have to go through in order where you declare the land surplus. This law does 2 things. It essentially creates a more structured process where you have to go at a public meeting when you are going through the process, the surplus lands process. You have to declare at a public meeting that you have surplus lands, and then that you plan to sell, and then there is a much more stringent process that you have to go through involving HCD, where you offer the land to potential developers who are interested in using the land for housing, and HCD has oversight over the process. One bill that's in your summary, but I didn't include on the housing on the PowerPoint because I don't know how germane it is to you, but it's AB 1486, which is it's called the Tenant Protection Act of 2019. It set in place new requirements that were essentially fairly limited rent control requirements that prevent that limited the ability of a landlord to raise rents on a number of housing types, primarily multifamily housing that's older, that generally caters more to lower income folks, and it imposes limits on the ability of landlords to evict their tenants without just cause. So with that, that's the summary of the remaining bills. I'd be happy to take any questions before you want to open it up for public comment.
Thank you. I'm hoping we have few or no questions because we have little time for public comment. Seeing none. Excuse me.
I do
Commissioner
have a question.
Anderson.
Would a just cause for eviction be because the landlord wants to convert the unit to a short-term rental instead of an annual lease?
For a short-term rental, no, I don't think that would be just cause. If you convert it to another use, a non-residential use, then that is just cause. But converting it to a short-term rental, I don't think would be permitted under the law.
So just take a second on the no density limit. Did you say that the height limits in place in a town would have to be obeyed?
Yes, subject to the additional concessions that they have the ability to seek an increase of 33 feet or 3 or more stories. So there is a limit, but it's higher than it would be for other types of projects.
Oh, okay. That's not the one that says there's no limit, no density limit.
No density limit. So the number of units, they could, however many units they can fit. You can't say, you can't say only 20 units an acre, even if that's the zoning on the property.
But you can say you can't have a 10-story building.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to open the meeting up to public comments. There's relatively little time, but we'll make the most of it.
Lorraine Stewart, St. Helena. I'm here as board chair of the Napa Valley Community Foundation with fellow board member Tom McBroom. And first of all, thank you for looking at all of this. I know you're not having fun, but I think some of it is super important, and I'm hoping that what we can tell you tonight in 2 minutes might be of help down the road. The Community Foundation sees ADUs as a really important piece of looking at market rate, workforce, and possibly affordable housing. Over the last couple years, we've been doing research, partnering, and fundraising in this area, and we have more to share than I'm going to try and share with you, but I do have four bullet points. Let me begin by saying that we are investing almost $500,000 in a collaboration, Napa-Sonoma County. We have put out a call for hire for a program director for an office that's going to focus solely on ADU development in both of these counties. The 4 bullet points. Conduct outreach and education to encourage more homeowners to build or purchase prefab ADUs. I know you're all feeling like, oh my gosh, we could have 6 units in 6 square feet or whatever. I think really we have the opposite problem, which is to encourage folks to help us add to workforce housing. Secondly, to host periodic workshops to encourage homeowners, along with giving them the technical assistance, including no-cost site assessments. And this is to help speed the adoption of ADUs. I don't know if you all know, but last year NOAA did attend a joint meeting that we had countywide of all of the commissioners as well as from the county planning staff. And the point of that meeting was to get feedback from the municipalities of what would be most helpful for you all in terms of encouraging and expediting ADUs. So that's a piece of the puzzle there, and that's what that addresses. Experiment with various incentives, tenant screening and placement. Some people are going to be nervous about figuring out who's going to be their tenant and is this the right choice. Looking for grants and loans to help folks. This is all to encourage homeowners to rent to our workforce at affordable rates. Lastly, partnering with our local jurisdiction, you all, to help you to encourage and expedite the process, and that's really what we're looking at. We've got a whole staff and a lot of work done over the last few years, and would really love to encourage you to connect with us and see, because I think it makes a lot of sense for the whole county to be doing this together and to have a program that works well up and down the county. So,
Do you have a phone number?
Thank you, Ms.
Do I have a
Stewart.
phone number? Yeah, or a website?
You know what I'll do tomorrow? I'll send these bullet points and notes with all the contact info, and Cindy can get that out
Thank
to all
you.
of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's 7:01, but I'll take one more speaker.
You already heard from the Community Foundation. Do you want to hear any more, or are you done?
Well, I'm really constrained with a commission meeting set for 7:10. So
This will be really quick. Steve Goldfarb.
thank you.
I am on our town, St. Helena, but I'm not here speaking on their behalf. Could I ask the city to post all this information that you've just received on your website or something? Because this is going to start to raise questions in the community, and it's better if they know specifically what the laws are saying than to make assumptions at this point.
Well, the detailed report and the PowerPoint images are already on the website as part of the agenda package.
That's fine.
So it's there. Thank you. That was so quick, I'll take one more.
From the audience. Just a little more background, I think, on why the affordable housing community sees ADUs as a particularly attractive option, and why I think you're going to see more proposals for them. Normal or more traditional affordable housing people like Habitat for Humanity have just about run out of options in Napa County. The land is not available and it's too expensive, and the math just doesn't work on these projects. We're looking at the number of potential ADU locations as being fairly significant. These are people with who might be cash poor but land rich. They have land. They perhaps need the extra income. We think there's a pretty good marketing opportunity for ADUs. I think that the city of St. Helena, as far as I can tell, has really got a leg up in terms of the planning and building people. They understand what's going on in the state. They understand what these laws were coming. And the things that we were afraid about, like coverage ratios, setbacks, covered parking, and that sort of thing, seems to have gone away in terms of ADUs. So I think that you ask what the Planning Commission can do, I think you can probably make sure that the pre-approval process, the question, when people come in and ask about projects, they get the right kinds of answers. You only see when the application's been made, but there's a whole lot that goes on before that. I would say that the one thing that you may be interested in, that I'm interested in, is a real hang-up on ADUs is going to be the mortgage funding. These ADUs do not fit normal underwriting standards. Most clients have modest income, or they're retired, and so they don't have the income to support the mortgage to build the ADU. Likewise, there are some appraisal problems. Do we include in the appraisal the primary home, or do we only, consider the ADU? This separate conveyance issue is an issue for lenders. Do I have a right to foreclose on that land if the client defaults? So we are also working with a group of Bay Area lenders, mortgage lenders, to try to find some solutions to this. So once again, thank you for your time. We do consider ADUs to be important. I think you're going to see more of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to adjourn this meeting so that we can take a 5-minute break before we start the next. I note that the next regular City Council meeting is scheduled for January 28th, and the next Planning Commission meeting is scheduled in 5 minutes. Thank you.